Sup, I promised you to show the Serilog output in Application Insights, the Serilog output we produced in previous video. After that, I'll show you what I added to my Serilog configuration, some extra enrichers I enriched my logs with, and I'll end the video with an alternative to request logging using Mediatr. If you don't know what Mediatr is, I have a video and I'll link that down below. So, Application Insights, you go to the portal Azure, you type in Application Insights at the top and click on the purple one. Then you see all your applications and you select the one you're interested in. For me, that's this one. Then you'll go to Logs and you might see some pop-up screens, just click them away. Then in the left column down below you see traces, requests and exceptions. That are the main ones we'll be focusing on. So let's just double click traces and then that comes in this query editor. So Application Insights uses some kind of query language. I'll go more into that in a bit. It takes a while to get used to, but it's fairly doable. Let's just try this out, traces, and I'm just interested in the last 30 minutes. Click run, and you'll see all kinds of logs. For this video's purpose, I left on the information log level, so we'll see way more output than we would want in a production environment. If this is your first deploy to production, feel free to leave on the information log level until you're confident that everything is running smoothly in production. Let's dig into that. We didn't use any request logging middleware yet. We're seeing the result logs from ASP.NET Core Serilog, the implementation. So this is just from ASP.NET Core, just telling us some requests happened from start to finish. We even see some logs output from the entity framework. So this database command, and you see the SQL query. And then we'll have to scroll to find something actually useful. That's why I mentioned, leave those log levels on warning so you don't pollute your log output. To find something more useful, of course, we can use this query language to query more specifically. Let's check that out. So I wrote a few query statements in here. Traces, union exceptions, project away a few columns, and order by the timestamp descending order. This just means we want to see the traces table and the exceptions table. And we're not interested in these columns. So we want to filter those out of the view below. And then we want our results to be ordered by the most recent one incoming. Let's execute that. You can just highlight what you want to execute. Let's say we just highlighted the traces, then we're going to see all the traces for the last 30 minutes, a bit like we saw before. If we then highlight the whole thing, we will get the result of this query. Let's go back to this project away. So I'm excluding columns from my table view below. You could also, of course, do project and then list all the only columns you want to include. And much more possibilities in querying. Feel free to play around with that. We'll just scratch the surface of what is possible. Then the query statement below does something similar, only we want to see the messages that contain login, and we're only taking 100 logs. We see timestamp, the actual log message. Custom dimensions is our custom data we enriched the logs with. Severity level could be 1, 2. That's an enumeration of the log levels, like value 2 would be the warning, value 1 is probably information. Item type trace could be also exceptions, since we have this union on exceptions. Could be requests if you add the requests in. Operations, information, client information, then app information, and then we have the custom dimensions, which is most relevant to us. I quickly run the top query again and opened up the custom dimensions of a log produced by our create metric command. So we see similar fields, only now we have an action name, so the create metric in the metrics controller, and elapsed milliseconds, so how long it took for that operation, the message template, long running requests, and then the arguments that are filled in. So it says like the elapsed milliseconds we just saw, name is below, that's the name of the class that produced the log. That's pretty interesting to know. And then the request. So let's take a look at the request. Also the source context kind of also tells us which class produced that log. And then we see actual data that would be in the request body, but we're not using request logging middleware, we're logging in our Mediatr pipeline. I'll talk more about that in a bit. I think you get the idea what's possible. We're just scratching the surface here. As I mentioned before, I'm going to exclude all of these output logs that were produced by the requests by ASP.NET Core middleware, and also the ones produced by EF Core. At least the information logs, I will filter those out by going to the code and setting those to warning. Let's first take a look at, I was running the app locally just to show you the output in the terminal as well. Why would I show you this? First off, I want to stress again, this is outputting a ton of logs just for a simple authentication request. It's logging, it's telling me a post happened from start to finish. It's telling me all the things that happened in between, like the Mediatr login command triggered, and then the create all tokens command triggered, and we see the masking active. I also masked the email just for video purposes. I will undo that for the production environment. So I could then use the logs to maybe help someone who got stuck in the authentication flow, for example. Please be mindful about this data. This is personally identifiable information like the email, the client IP, the region. Don't be just leaking that information. Sensitive information we don't want anyone to see, like passwords and bank accounts, all those things. And JSON Web Token secrets, for example. Below, see the secrets. But the point of me showing this is all of these logs were output, and there's only a few I'm actually interested in. That's the login command, the create authentication command, since those are custom logs produced by my code. All the rest is kind of framework logs. So now I'll show you what I added to my Serilog configuration. I can show you both the development one and the production settings, since I'm not exposing any of my other credentials. Let's take a look. So Serilog, then we have all the minimum levels in development. ASP.NET Core and Entity Framework Core I'll set to warning because they're polluting my local logs. Then to enrich the logs even more, we added a few NuGet packages. Let's check out the project file. Some enrichers and the sinks were already there. You must include these namespaces in the between the using brackets for the enrichers and the sinks to become active. For this low context, we didn't need any extra, that's kind of built in. Then we have the client IP, correlation ID, machine name, and environment name. These are coming from the client info, these are coming from the environment enricher. And then we have the sensitive data masking. You saw I just added the secret for the JWT tokens, and then we have, so that's the properties to mask, and then the properties that are masked by default but we don't want to mask is the email. Then we have this write to console, since this is the development app setting. I'll talk about the correlation ID in a bit, but let's first check out the production settings. So we have something similar, Serilog, then the log levels. I set this to information just for this video purposes. I'm gonna revert that to warning. Then we see something similar, the using statements, only of course we're using the application insights instead of the console. And we have the same enrichers. Why do I include all these enrichers? Of course, because I want to have a similar experience locally than on production, so I don't mindfuck my future self. And what I forgot to stress is you see all these enrichers, yet you don't see the client IP and all these details in the console logs, because this is just the message with, the log message. This is not all the other extra enriched properties. Sensitive data masking, similarly as in development. Of course, we exclude the email. Oh, sorry, we're back at. So in production, similarly as in development, we're and comment that one, and then we write to the application insights. So that's the entire configuration. I will put a template for this on my Patreon. I'll make sure to leave the link down below. So then lastly, I kept stressing, please don't attempt to log the request body by using some kind of middleware, since the request body is a stream and then you would have to read the stream into memory asynchronously or synchronously, and it's gonna impact your overall API performance, which might not be all that useful because you'll be logging all the requests and all the request details all the time. Which is a bit like reporting the news on everything that went well today. It's a bit silly. So since we're using Mediatr, I'll present you with an alternative to request logging, and that is just logging in the Mediatr pipeline. So just as you have the request pipeline with the request response cycle, you have a Mediatr pipeline, some kind of cycle within Mediatr. The advantage of that is that happens. Let me quickly show you in a controller. Mediatr gets called inside of the controller method, which means this request body is already read, so we don't have to read out the stream in memory anymore. We can just access this data, which makes it a good place to log whatever was passed along in the login command, for example. So let's take a look at this logging behavior. That's just like pipeline behavior. I use the request preprocessor. That's basically something that's going to log before we execute the login command. So we could then log whatever was passed to the login command. But you might as well make this a pipeline behavior. We can see a sample in here. You might as well make a pipeline behavior, because then you can also have the response. You can also access the response. So you could log the request and the response if you really wanted to. In this case, this performance behavior, we're just timing how long the response took and then write a custom log with the request info, and then telling us long running request. It took, for example, more than 2 seconds. That's too long. Everything longer than 500 milliseconds. So you have the request here, and you have the response. So we're doing something before the login command by this example, and something after the login command. So this would be an option to log the request body, the data passed to the login command. So you could see that a bit similar as the request, since we're just this request, we're getting it from the request body, and then we're just passing on the request body to the login command. So that's a way to log the actual data. But that is a successful path, because if this throws a bad request or anything, you're not going to enter this method. But that's actually the job of exception handling and your validation. The validation would then throw an exception informing you that either one of the credentials was wrong or was not meeting the, for example, the length requirement or the password complexity and those kind of things. So that's the job of the validation, throwing an exception, and then your exception handler to correctly output that information to the client. So let's get back to our logging behavior. So I made a request preprocessor instead of a pipeline behavior. And all it does is it injects the logger, and then this is from the request preprocessor. Then you have the request in here, which you can access. We get the request name, and then we write a custom log saying request name, and then the request details. The request details for the login command example will then contain the email and the password, which are hopefully, at least the password is hopefully masked out. The name in this example would be login command, so we know which class actually triggered it, because we don't want the name to be logging behavior, but since that would be the same for every command and not distinguishable. What you could also add in here is some kind of trace ID or correlation ID. For example, just saying like good, new good. Yeah, you have to, of course. Let's say new good, and then we have to call this. Then let's call it trace ID, and then you'd have this good.new good. If you do something like that, make sure to configure your service as scoped, not as transient, since you'd want to have that same trace ID for the entire session for all the requests that specific client or session user has produced. For example, if you would then trigger sending a message to the Azure service bus, you could pass along this trace ID, and then you could, in application insights, maybe filter or group by this trace ID and see in the chronological order kind of the steps, the path the user took. So first they called the login command, and then the create authentication command, and then maybe they sent a verification email. I'm just saying something, and then you get I hope you get the picture. So now I mentioned this correlation ID, so let's get into that. So the correlation ID would be more like a request header. So that could be coming from your front end, and then once in the back end that could get extracted and added to your custom logs. So by default it's going to check your HTTP request headers for this header key, and then enrich your logs with the value. And then that should be reflected in this add request log statement. I am not going to use this logging behavior since I'm not interested in everything that went well. I'm more interested in what went wrong, where the validation complained or the performance complained, or maybe even an exception I didn't catch. I have other tools for those jobs. So let's recap. I showed you these Serilog output and application insights. I briefly showed you how you can query those logs in application insights. I showed you my entire Serilog configuration, which is a pretty good setup for your real-world applications to put those into production and monitor them in production. And then I showed you an alternative way to log more of the request information, more of the data sent through your application by using the Mediatr pipeline instead of the request middleware. I hope you enjoyed this episode and the entire playlist, the entire series. If there's something I forgot or you want me to elaborate upon, please let me know in the comments. If there's anything else you would like to see or hear from me, let me know. I will be putting that Serilog configuration on my Patreon, and I'll leave the link in the description. Give me some time to do that. If you haven't subscribed already, please do. I'm trying to reach 500 subscribers so I can directly ask you guys what topics I should make videos on, what you want to learn. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching.